Good morning and welcome to Breaking Burnout for Nurses podcast. Today I have Dr. Hepshirat Ahmadi. She was on my guest before, and I wanted to bring her back so that she could talk to us about bioidentical hormones. She feels like they're very important, and I have heard some people raving about it. So let's learn more about that. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on your show again.
Mhm.
I feel very passionate about bioidentical hormones because to me, they're very anti aging. So, one of the things
Ooh.
that happens to us, yes, as we get older, is not
Yes.
only do we stop producing as much digestive enzymes, but we also stop producing as much hormones. And that has an impact on a lot of aspects of our function, including our immune function, our bone health, how easy it is for us to fall asleep and stay asleep. So that's one reason why sometimes older people have a harder time with sleep is because their hormone balance is not the same as it was when they were younger. So there's all kinds of myths out there about bioidentical hormones. So I just wanted to dispel some of the most common ones right from the beginning, even though you didn't ask me. But there are plenty of people that I meet that are worried about possibly going on bioidentical hormones because
Yeah. First, before we start that,
yes.
what is bioidentical hormone? What is a
So
bioidentical hormone?
that's a really great question. So bioidentical hormones are hormones that may be synthesized in the lab, but they have the exact same chemical structure as the hormones that our own body makes. Most of the time in Western medicine, we are given medications that have at least some difference between the chemical structure of the medication and what our own body produces. And the simple and financial reason for that is that you can't get a patent on a naturally occurring substance. You can only get a patent on substances that you have modified in a unique way, like attached a different, molecule or atom on, or took one away here or there. That you can patent, but you can't patent hormones that or substances that naturally exist in the human body. You can patent ways of getting them or extracting them or whatever, but you can't patent the actual substance itself. So, for example, in Western medicine, it has been far more common in the past for them to utilize hormones that were not chemically the same as the ones in our bodies. So, for example, Premarin, which a lot of people have heard of, is actually derived from pregnant mare's urine, which is where they get the name Premarin from. So that means it's not even, all the chemicals are not even in the same species as human beings. Some of them are from horses in that instance. And so there's a huge difference between, the hormones that we make and the hormones that are synthetic, basically. And unfortunately, because of doctors' habits in the past of just putting a lot of menopausal women on Premarin and Provera, and this was the combination called Prempro. The Premarin, like I say, that was synthetic, and so was the Provera. The Provera was not the same as the actual human progesterone. And so when a study was done by the World Health Organization some time ago, I forget exactly when, but anyway, they did a very large study which showed that there was an elevated danger of breast cancer and also blood clots among women who were taking, Premarin and maybe even Provera. And so after a point in time, they just basically stopped putting women on this willy nilly and they just dropped them. They just said,
Mhm.
okay, we'll discontinue taking it, because apparently the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. But you see, there's a vast difference between human estrogens and Premarin. And there's also a big difference between Provera and progesterone. So, natural human hormones prescribed appropriately in the appropriate amounts not only do not increase your risk for cancer, but they can actually help to decrease your risk for cancer, as well as decrease your risk for a lot of other problems like a weak immune system or like problems sleeping, or like osteopenia or osteoporosis, because the
Mm.
reason why women often have these things, especially once they're postmenopausal, is because they're not producing as much progesterone. And one of the things that progesterone does, one of the many things that it does, is to actually promote the building of bone. So there's a doctor named Dr. John Lee, who's a family practice doctor. Yay! And he wrote books about he wrote books about his research on progesterone and its effects on women and their bone mass. And he actually found that instead of just slowing down the rate of bone loss, the way that certain medications or giving certain estrogen types of things might do, but he found that by giving progesterone, he could actually help women to rebuild bone, to actually get denser and stronger bone from taking progesterone, which
Mhm.
makes sense, really, because when you think about
Mm.
it, the time in a woman's life when her progesterone levels are the highest is when she's pregnant. And that's when the baby is using that progesterone, among other things, to help build its bones. So these things are really important, I think. And unfortunately, most people in the United States can go through their entire life without ever having their hormones measured. And sometimes, even when they ask their doctors to measure their hormone levels, the doctors are unwilling to do it for various reasons that sometimes have nothing to do with health, but rather that they just don't want to be labeled as being an overutilizer by prescribing lab tests that are unnecessary. Then their HMOs that they're participating in might drop them. So they might be reluctant to prescribe any tests for somebody who looks externally fairly normal. And that can be kind of a disadvantage. If you look too normal, then a lot of times doctors will say, hey, well, I've actually had a patient tell me that her doctor said that he could just tell by looking at her that she had no
Oh,
hormonal problems, and therefore that he was not going to order hormone tests.
oh my
So
gosh.
he must be pretty good if he could tell that just by looking at her.
Oh, oh my,
But
yeah, that's
hormonal
an
problems
extreme
are,
talent.
yeah, hormonal problems are
Mm.
vastly underdiagnosed. And I'll just mention a couple of other hormones that I frequently deal with in my practice, because there's been an epidemic of anxiety and stress ever since the pandemic. I mean, it was bad before the pandemic, but it
Mm.
became exponentially worse during the pandemic.
Yes.
And, stress and trauma can really drain the adrenals. And the adrenals are glands that sit on top of our kidneys that make hormones, among which is cortisol. And even though so many people have heard bad things about cortisol, what happens if your cortisol levels get too high, you get belly fat, and we've seen commercials where you're supposed to buy this supplement that's going to help with weight loss by curtailing your cortisol levels. Well, the thing that they don't mention on there is that nature likes a balance. It doesn't like too much, but it also doesn't like too little. And actually, too
Mhm.
little cortisol is even worse than too much, because too little cortisol, all other things being equal, will cause excess inflammation. And that's the mechanism of so many diseases, is excess inflammation. And so this is the reason why when patients are having inflammatory or immune problems, conventional doctors will often give them synthetic steroids like cortisone and
Mm.
prednisolone and
Mm.
dexamethasone. And all of these are synthetic analogs of the body's own cortisol. And while they may be helpful because they're extremely anti inflammatory, even more so than our own cortisol, but the problem is that since they are synthetic and since they don't naturally occur in the human body, we have not evolved the proper enzymes to really be able to break them down and excrete them efficiently. And therefore, they tend to accumulate in our body over time as we take them, which is why most decent doctors, if they
Mm.
start a person on steroids, are not going to keep them on them indefinitely, because they know it would
Mm.
be bad for their bone health, their immune system, and their blood sugar regulation. But if a person's hypoadrenal, meaning that their levels of cortisol are too low, and this is oftentimes what happens when somebody has been chronically stressed or traumatized. And I think about poor burned out nurses who are having
Mhm.
to work such long hours under such conditions of high stress
Mhm.
that I would be willing to bet you that many of them actually have cortisol levels that are too low. And you
Mhm.
might say, well, what kinds of symptoms could a person get if their cortisol levels were too low? Well, one thing
Mhm.
they could feel is too weak, sometimes slightly dizzy, more aches and pains.
Oh God.
All of that will come from having cortisol levels that are too low. And yet,
Hmm.
most of the time, this is never diagnosed and it's
Mhm.
not addressed appropriately either
Mm.
because most doctors, even the ones who prescribe bioidentical hormones, don't prescribe cortisol. And one last thing I'll say about, bioidentical hormones for now, and that is that there are also a large population of people who have subtle thyroid disorders that have not either been diagnosed properly by their doctors because doctors are really only decent and not even very decent at detecting gross abnormalities. Okay. It's
Mhm.
got to be pretty big and overt before they will even run any tests, much less all of the appropriate tests. So, what I have found is that there are patients who need very tiny amounts of thyroid hormones, amounts that most doctors would say, well, that's not going to do anything. Why are you even prescribing that? Things like
Mhm.
1 microgram or 3 micrograms of T3, or maybe 7.5 micrograms of T4. These are tiny amounts that are way lower than what most doctors would start with. But what they don't realize is that a person's hormonal balance is determined not only by the levels of hormones that they have, but also, and even more importantly, probably, by how well those hormones combine with their receptors. And this is an electromagnetic aspect of the person's functioning that is never measured when doing lab tests. So, what I've learned is that three different patients could have the exact same level of the
Mhm.
exact same hormone, and it could all be right in the middle of the normal range. And yet, one person out of the three could be truly functioning normally, another person could be hypofunctioning, and another person could be hyperfunctioning, all with the same level of hormones, depending upon whether the hormone bound to its receptor for an optimal length of time, or whether it bound too tightly and stayed too long, or whether it bound too loosely and came unbound too quickly. So, the lab tests may not even demonstrate that there is any abnormality. And oftentimes, doctors who do those tests, even though they may not do a complete test, they may do just a TSH, for example, thyroid
Mhm.
stimulating hormone, and feel like, okay, if it comes back normal, then there can't be any problem with the thyroid. But that's not
Mhm.
true unless they also test a free T3 and a free T4. They don't know whether there could be abnormal levels of that, even though the TSH is normal. That's very possible, and I've seen it a number of times. But even if all of it is normal, even if the TSH is normal, even if the free T4 and the free T3 is normal, there could still be an abnormal function if the patient's own hormones do not bind to their receptors well. And that's one of the things that the quantum biofeedback can show
Mm.
me. I can't learn what a person's levels are through using the quantum biofeedback, but I do get
Mhm.
instant clues about whether their function is normal or hyper or hypo. And then if we want to do more investigation, we can have them do a lab test. But even the lab test alone, it will tell me what levels they're making, but
Mhm.
it won't tell me what they most need to be taking, because sometimes people need to take more of something that there's already present in excess of amounts to try to compensate for the fact that the person's own receptors bind to it so poorly. And sometimes, if you give a person something that they're deficient in, they might have a bad reaction to it. I've seen that too. So, all I can say is that hormones are really powerful. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about them is that they affect mood also. So,
Yeah, definitely.
people who are functionally hypothyroid
Mhm.
um, can be more depressed and more constipated.
Gee.
And
Okay.
chronic constipation can lead to thyroid problems. So it becomes like a vicious cycle. So,
So how exactly would you start a biofeedback? I'll call it a procedure, but your biofeedback examination of a patient. What would
well,
be, would you do, you would
I just plug
do,
the information into my device, their name, their date of birth, where they were born, and certain numbers that relate to their lifestyle habits, like how many times did they exercise and things like that, how many glasses of water did they drink. So I give them the questionnaire, they give me back the information, I plug the information into the device, and then I have the device calibrate to them, which just means that it's arranging itself so that the only frequencies it's picking up on are the patient's frequencies. So this is kind of like if you had a radio and you tuned it into a specific station, there might be all these other radio and TV stations out there broadcasting, but your radio would only be receiving the frequencies from the station it was tuned into. So that's what we do when we calibrate to a patient. And then I run a little test. This is like a little 3-minute test that bounces like 9,000 different frequencies off the patient's bioidentical field in a forwards order and a backwards order to see which ones they react to the most. And this also gives me a lot of very specific information about how they're functioning in many, many, many different departments. And so on the first visit, my main goal is to assess them, see what's going on with them, try to explain it to them, and then develop a plan for how to start optimizing their health as naturally as possible. So that's
okay. And I think you mentioned something about that you could do it remotely, partially.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Like
you don't
from
even have
me
to
in
come for the first.
California.
Yes, yes, I could do that. I could do that. And as a matter of fact, if you're curious about that, what I could have you do is to fill out the new patient information forms, which are available on my website, which is www.greatnaturaldoctor, with doctor being spelled out.com. Just the required forms section of there. If you want to go into that and fill it out and submit it online, I can actually run a test and print you out some information. I won't go into a whole analysis of it because, I just want to demonstrate to you what is possible to find out just by running a test. But I think you'd probably find it pretty interesting. So I'd be happy to do that for you if you
Well,
want.
I'm very interested, and I think my nurses are very interested. So, okay, it's already been almost 20 minutes.
I know, it's incredible.
It goes
I
so
just keep
fast.
rambling on. That's why,
No,
that's why the
it's
time goes quickly.
it's great information, and we want more. So I'm going to have you put some more information on my website, your information. So you could go to my website at www.breakingburnout.com to get more details about you and about your biofeedback
Thank you
procedure
so
and,
much.
how to learn more about this. So anyway, thank you so much for being
Well,
on my
thank you.
show.
Thank you.
And
I really
okay,
appreciate it.
we got to have you back. You're just going to be my resident MD that will come back
I
on
would
the
love
show.
to. I love
How
I
does that
love
sound?
nurses, and nurses are wonderful.
Okay, well, great. So we will keep in contact, and we will see you next time. Everybody, have a
Okay.
great day.
Thank you so much. Bye.